3. Okay.
So this is the bead that I'm going to demonstrate today. First, we're going to make an encased aventurine stringer, which is right here. And then we're going to make a lace twisty, which is just clear and white, and that's what's here. We'll probably take a breath and then build this bicone shape. And then on top of that, we'll add both of these embellishments with this nice little pinch that's in here, which is really, it almost makes it look like tapestry or weaving to me. If there's a formal name for that technique, I don't know what it is. All right. I'm going to start off with aventurine beads. You can buy chunks of aventurine to work with, but I just don't happen to have any on hand. And I have had a lot of good success using aventurine beads. Every once in a while, I've had one that turns black and sooty, and then I don't use that one. But generally, I've been using this strand for a while. That's why I'm down to only 6 beads. So what I did is I took a bead off the strand and I broke it in half. If you don't break it in half and you use it the way it started out, which was one whole bead like that, the air bubble that's created by the hole in the bead can be problematic. And in any event, they tend to crack in half. So I start by breaking them in half. I'm going to be using these nice punties that are sold by Heather Trimlett on her website. They're very comfortable, nice to use. As some waste glass or buffer glass, I'm using just Moretti Super Clear, and I'm going to encase the stone in this, it's a very pale lilac. It might even be rose. I have a filter on the camera, but I also have my torch glasses on, so maybe I'm a little off on the color. You'll probably notice I'm using tungsten tweezers to manipulate the aventurine. That's just my preferred tweezer. There's a little bit of glass residue on here, which is why I'm starting it gingerly. And I'm going to apply a little bit of the just plain old clear glass onto the punty. The reason for that is, even though I'm going to encase this stringer in the pale lilac, this will end up mostly being wasted, so I'll waste some clear on the end. Not planning on wasting too much. I'm going to pull a fairly thick stringer. I actually pulled one earlier today. Let's see, and I measured it, and it runs about 2.5 millimeters. So it gets a little thick down here, which is where I cut it off. So I've just added a little bit of the clear. Now I'm going to put some of my lilac. You don't have to do this, use the 2 different glasses, but sometimes your encasing color is pricey or precious, like if you're using Rubino Oro, and then you don't want to bother using that expensive glass for the beginning of your piece. So now I'm making a little platform, essentially, which is going to be where I'm going to stick the aventurine pieces. Now, in a perfect world, my kiln would be on, and these aventurine pieces would be warmed up maybe to about 1,000 degrees, and I'd pull them out one at a time. And the reason I say in a perfect world is because I don't want my kiln clicking on and off through this whole demo, so it's not on. So what I'm doing instead is I'm trying to keep my punty warm, that's in my left hand, and I'm also trying to gingerly warm this piece of aventurine. You never really want to heat it to the point of getting melty in the flame, because exposing the aventurine to too much heat like that will dull it. So what I'm looking for is that little hot end on my aventurine, a little bit of softness on my punty, stick them together so that the lilac glass kind of flows up around the piece of aventurine. And now I'll just try to keep that from blowing apart on me in the back of my flame. Now I'll pick up the second half of that same aventurine bead, and again, if this one fractures, I'll just skip it and use half, but in a perfect world. Of course, when things go wrong, they go wrong in a demo. All right, now I'm going to stick this piece again into the punty, and then I will squeeze it down onto the surface of the earlier piece. The reason I say it that way, you'll see there's a space there, right? The reason I take it down a little bit at a time with a little bit of heat is because I'd rather not trap air in between the two pieces of aventurine. And I can see, you know, a little bit of a curve of the bead leaves me with a little bit of a space there, but that's pretty good, and that's on there. Now, there are people who would just heat this and pull it, and you do end up with an aventurine stringer, but for my money, it's worth the time and energy to keep it cool, or relatively cool, of course, and encase it with molten glass, because I find that you get magnification of the sparkle from the encasing and also a little color shift. So I'm making a hot gather of the rose or lilac, and I'm really pushing it onto this aventurine, because I don't want to trap any air bubbles as I encase. So anytime I'm encasing a crevice or a bump in the surface, I'm really pushing it on there so as to be sure. I feel my punty starting to crack, so I'm just going to go back and put some heat in it. So I'm pushing on those hot gathers because that's my way of minimizing or preventing bubbles. So once I have the whole thing covered, I'm getting pretty close. I lost track of where I was as I was repairing. I'll put on another layer just so that I have more encasing. And again, you don't want to pull this so thin that the core aventurine is a tiny little hair inside 2 millimeters, because at some point you've really lost the sparkle. But when you're going to end up at 2 or 3 millimeters, having the transparent color around your pieces of aventurine does definitely give you magnification. So I've gotten some transparent glass on there. I'm going to make another sort of pad on the other side, and I'm going to add a little bit of clear on top of that pad, and then we'll stick the other punty on. So I am mindful that where I started, my first punty always has to be babysat. You don't want it to get too cold. So I'm just cleaning it up a little bit. I'm not obsessed with precision about this. I see one spot that could use a little more of the lilac. There we go. I think I've got it all now. Sometimes I have to take off my torch glasses just to see what the heck I'm doing if I've missed any spots. But unencased spots do tend to glow a little differently. So if you're mindful of that, you can usually see it before it's too late. And by too late, I mean before it's so soupy that you have to start to pull your stringer. Now, I'm going to preheat the second punty so it's starting to glow. And I'm going to preheat the end of the gather of glass. They're both going to be pretty glowing hot. I'm going to stick them together, and then I'm going to do kind of up, down, left, right, so that I know that that punty is really in there. Now, I'm not going to go into the hottest part of my flame just yet, which would be about here. Instead, I'm going to give this bundle a chance to come up to a more even temperature. Remember, in there are really two kind of warm but not molten pieces of aventurine. surrounded by a whole bunch of lilac, and so, which went on molten. So I wanna give the whole thing a chance to begin to get hot at the core. If you pull too soon on something like this, and I hope not to demonstrate this, but it happens. If you pull too soon, you get what looks like the mouse that swallowed the snake that swallowed a mouse, you know, long, skinny thing with a big bump in the middle, because the aventurine just doesn't stretch. So you stretch all that glass, but you're left with a lump of aventurine. So rather than rush into the hottest part of the flame, I'm really pouring heat into this. I can see that it's encased. I can see that it's sparkly. I don't know if all that comes across. And I can sort of push in and out to see how much it's moving at any given point in time. And when the time comes to pull, I'm going to come out and really start with a pretty slow pull in my goal to get a fat stringer. You may even hear me blow on it a little bit because I try to get it to stop moving. And if you hear something in the background, that's my dog playing around with his food bowl, probably. So I think I'm just about there. I can see that when I go in and out with my hands and when I bend, my aventurine is moving. I can see that it's almost twisting inside there. So I'm going to come into a little bit hotter spot, a little closer to my body. This is a mega minor, so I'm very familiar with like where the hot spot is. And then I'm going to come out, and I am going to pull slowly at first, watching that the aventurine is pulling out, which it is. So when I can set my 2 millimeters, I will blow on it, which will help my stringer hold that diameter for the full length of the pull. It's pretty good on the left. My right still has a little bit of thickness to it, but of course you're always going to use that for something. And then I'm going to cut it here because to my left in this part is all transparent glass, very little aventurine. And here I have my aventurine stringer. I usually pull about a foot. Here's the last one, here's this one, and I think that, you know, that'll work just fine. There's the two, and I may even use both of them. Usually when I pull a stringer, I work pretty quickly, and I will touch it with wet tweezers right about here where it's a little thick, and it'll crack off. But, you know, I was sitting around admiring it, so... Yep, it's fractured, and by the time we come back, I was going to say when we come back, it'll be broken off, but it already is. Okay, now we're going to stop recording for a second. I'm going to set up for the next demo, which is a twisty.
Running.
In this portion of the demonstration, I'm going to show you how to make a lace twisty. Basically, this is a core of clear glass with 4 white stringers that wrap around it. To make it, I am going to use a piece of 10 millimeter glass. I just cut this off of a thicker rod that I had. But if you don't have any 10 millimeter glass, you can just, you know, make a thick cylinder from clear rods. Then I'm going to use some regular Moretti clear. This is about 5 millimeters, I'd say. And I have some commercial stringer. They're not the same diameter. I have a little bit here that is. But anyway, they're sold as 2 millimeters, even though they're probably not. This one is 2, but the one I have on my bench next to it is 3, I think. But anyway, I think what I'll do is I'll just tack together these 2 little pieces of 2, and then maybe this will be enough for me. I actually first learned this twisty from Tom and Sage Holland many, many years ago at a class after the Oakland gathering. So I just stuck those 2 together, and by the time I'm ready to use them, they likely will be still together. I'm going to use the same punties that I used for the last twisty. I really do like these because they're thinner in my hand, but thicker at the end. You could always use a fat mandrel if you don't have a punty like this. Or you could use 2 fat rods of borosilicate glass. There's a few different options. And all I'm doing is I'm gonna stick one end of this fat rod onto my punty here. I want the punty to be glowing. It's stuck on there pretty good. And now I'm gonna keep this whole thing warm. And yeah, it would be good if it was centered, so I'm gonna move it so it's centered because it isn't. I'm gonna build my twisty on this piece of glass. That's a little better. And then I will attach the other punty, the partner of this one, on the other end. I will say, if you've never made twisties before, this lace twisty is a little more advanced than some, and I might recommend that you start with something more basic. And I'll give another plug for the class that I'm offering through the ISGB. In that class, we have a very simple example of a twisty. So I'm keeping the fat rod of clear warm. And now I'm going to add 4 equally spaced rods of clear. So what I'm doing is I warm the end to get it to stick, the end of this rod that I'm adding, and I'm heating it down onto the surface of the fat 10 millimeter. And then when I get to the far end, where the 10 millimeter rod ends, I'm just wrapping around the far end. And now I'm going to heat this again to make sure that it's really attached. And as sort of an advantage of that, while it's hot, I'm going to give it a little pinch to make it a little bit of a fin shape. I'm not looking for something that's very skinny, but it will stand up away from the base rod. Now I'm just going to keep doing that till we have 4 on here. I'm using a tweezer that is a non-serrated tweezer. So when I squeeze the fin to flatten it a little bit, I'm not introducing any divots into the fin that would then be potential air bubbles. So you have to worry about that. The torch that I'm using, the tweezers that I'm using are called Italian style, I believe, and are sold by Aerosprings. And they look like that. So the one that I just put on is right here, I think. Nope, it's this one. So I'm going to heat it. That'll help me be sure it's adhered. And I'm also going to give it a little bit of a pinch. Again, it doesn't have to be thin. I'm just trying to keep it out of the way of the next 2 that are going to go on. I can see a little spot that I missed. There we go. Okay, that's 2. Here come 2 more. I have to be mindful of the need to keep the punty hot. I don't want the glass to crack there. And every time I add a fin, I start by adhering it to the punty, and that gives me a little extra security because the hot glass introduces heat to the punty. Okay, so number 4 isn't the straightest one I've ever done, but it doesn't matter. I'll just pinch it till it's in the right position. There we go. So what I'm looking for here is 4 fins. Can you see there's 4 around there?
Yeah.
Okay. And now I'm going to take a moment to heat my punty again. I'm always mindful of that. I might even, using my trusty little paring knife, make sure that all the fins are stuck down. This is also a chance to maybe clean a little excess off the far end. These twisties get pretty soupy because white, you know, is a soupy color, and so I'm not going to be a hero in terms of how big of a twisty I'm making for you. And luckily I have the one I made yesterday if I need it. So I'm just putting some heat in now because I want to straighten this out and start with a straight gather. Okay, so there it is. That's pretty nice. Now I'm going to pre-warm the stringer a little bit just by bouncing it around in the flame. And I'm going to heat the tip, tack it down at the metal punty, and using the flame and a little bit of pressure in my right thumb, I'm going to push that stringer down in the gully between 2 fins. And then I'm going to make sure with a little bit of heat that it's well attached. I always flip and do the opposite side next because you're introducing heat into the core of this thing. And if you move around with where you work on it, you have the advantage of keeping up the heat base without having to stop to heat the whole thing. You know that your stringer application is doing the heating for you. All right, and this is still a pretty big, long piece, so we'll have plenty, I'm sure. Heating them on, making sure they're attached. You've all had the experience of heating a stringer that you've just applied and then it flies off on your bench or in your face. And that's usually because when that's a cold connection, and it arises because when you applied that stringer, there was too big a difference in the temperature of the base glass and the glass you were applying. And so that's called a cold connection when those are very disparate. And that can happen here too. So I'm going back to heat them on. And if something does fly off when you're trying this, one of your first efforts, just pick it up and stick it back on. I don't think that this is such a precision piece that you have to feel that you've lost your opportunity just because it's going to be patched together. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat I'm going to heat my punty, and I'm going to heat the open end of this rod. And when they're both glowing hot, I'm going to put the punty into the end. And I'm going to go up, down, left, right. And I'm going to start to, a little crooked again. Must be that time of day. What I'm doing now is I want to heat up the length of this thing. So by angling my hands like this, Heather Trimlett says this is like how you would ride a tricycle with the handlebars like this. By keeping my hands working in tandem and angling them like this, I can direct the heat up the full length of my twisty, or twisty to be. Isn't there yet? And I'm looking for a few things. I'm looking for my fins to relax down. I'm looking for my white to melt and then become transparent. And I'm looking for the entire thing to kind of assume a football shape. So I will keep heating until I'm starting to see those signs. Always trying to keep my hands working in tandem. And if they start to pull apart a little bit, which is normal, I will push them toward each other so that rather than stretching, I'm kind of puffing up a little bit. I'm seeing the fins soften. Getting toward that football-y shape, and also I am just about seeing the white disappear. I don't know how clear that is on camera, but I can still see the ghost of some of the white, but basically it is just about gone. I'm gonna come out, I'm gonna rock it to and fro a little bit until I feel like it is beginning to set up. Usually I can see the white returning. And that's when, see, I can just start to see, I'm just gonna start twisting ever so slowly, because I don't want to twist it too tight or the white will bunch up on itself. So I wanna keep it, remember, I wanted it a little bit on the fat side. And I can only twist with one hand today because I'm having a problem with my other hand. So I've got to be a fast twister in one hand. There we go. That's pretty good. So there we go. It's the whole thing there. And I'm going to cut it right about there. I think it starts to get to its uniform diameter. Okay. So I will set up for making this bead, but there's your lace twisty. It's a really pretty little twisty, and whatever color you put it down on is really enhanced by the twisty on top. Now what we're going to do is we are going to make the bead that is at the heart of this. Just to remind you where we're going to what is called a bicone shape. That is 2 cones, foot to foot. And the bicone could be quite a peak right here, but actually I'm going to soften the peak a little bit. I'm going to build this in a way that I teach beginners. It's not the only way to build a bicone. There's lots of ways. I'm using Fusion Products Inc. bead release. Sometimes people want to know that. So I have to just bring it to a dull glow, and then it will be ready to use. So I guess, let's see, I haven't plugged that class in 5 or 10 minutes. But this beginner way of making a bicone is something that we spend quite a bit of time on in that class. So I'm just going to do this and I hope that you'll take something away from it. It's different than how many people do it, I think. And as part of that, you get to see how I would make spacer beads and tubes and such. So it does really show a lot. But in terms of how I work in the flame and how I build spacers, I think that is for another class. Oh, coincidentally, that class that the ISGB is offering about shapes. Okay, seriously. This way of making a bicone starts with 2 spacer beads that are about, I'm just going to look and see how big this bead was so I'm close, about as far apart as you expect your ultimate bead to be hole to hole. And the reason for that is a lot of people have trouble when they're making shapes on the mandrel, and the trouble they encounter is that they overheat the ends and they get kind of football ends or pointy ends. And so this method of building a bead will prevent that, assuming that you have the heat control to keep both little spacers that you start with warm. Now, of course, that becomes easier as you build the bead, because when the 2 beads are connected by a core of hot glass, they're a lot less shocky. So I'm keeping everything warm. And again, I'm not teaching this to you in detail, but hopefully it will give you some idea of how I would first start people who want to learn how to make bicones. This isn't the only way. if you do this, be careful when you add molten glass close to the existing end beads that you don't have two different heat bases. The inside of the spacer bead that's sitting on the mandrel and the glass that you're adding both have to be pretty hot so that you don't end up with long, thin bubbles that are trapped at those ends, and that can happen. But if I was teaching now how to make a tube, this is how I would start beginners making tubes. I keep the whole thing hot. Not going to really make a refined tube because we know that we're headed to a bicone, but this is how I show people their first efforts at a tube. Just filling in a divot that I left behind, you know, using my eyes to kind of sketch in where the surface of a tube would be. I think that's pretty close. For our purposes, it will be fine. And you might also notice I switch hands. That's because I am a very dominant righty. My right hand is really the one I can control. So notice that my end beads are still a very dark purple, almost black. And that's because even though I'm letting the heat get very close, I am not remelting those ends. And as I said, if this was going to be a tube bead, which it'll be pretty close to in a moment, I would stop and refine it and add glass where it obviously needs more. Okay, I'm going to add it in a few spots, and then we're going to move on to create the bicone. You have to be sure that what you're adding like this is really molten. Otherwise, when you press it against the bead and roll it on, you will break your bead release. And on something this long, sometimes bead release can be broken and the bead can survive, but it does make your life a little harder. I do have a torch-mounted marver, and I could be rolling this on that marver, but as I may have mentioned, I'm wearing close-up glasses, so it's just easier for me to see on a handheld marver. All right, so now we've sketched in a tube. I'm not going to bother making it any nicer than it is because we're about to obliterate it. But if you think about a bicone, it is two cones foot to foot. And that means that in the center, it is the largest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the bulk of my glass. Oh, thank you, Neil. I was looking for my big marver, and Neil just found it for me. I really appreciate that. So in the center of the bead, and by the way, this color is purple medium. So it's just your regular old ephetrite purple, medium, transparent. I'm just making tall disc in the very center. I'm not worried about it being pretty, but I am trying to complete my wraps so that the same amount of glass is added all the way around. And I would say this was the 4th wrap that I'm putting on now. Now I know that that's going to be the peak of my bead, and my bead is going to taper to the right and the left. So if that was 4 wraps, I know that less glass will be something around 3 perhaps, or 2. So let's see, we're going to put on There's one all the way around. And this is not, it's a great place to practice discs, but it isn't crucial that they be lovely because they're going to get melted down. It's number 2. And you'll notice that because I'm working, I think we'll just try 1 right here. Because I'm working through the flame, I can just add as much glass as I want because I keep making more gathers as the glass flows down onto the base bead. If I turn slowly, I get more glass. If I whip it around quick, I get less glass. All right. So you can see, I think, that there's an angle here. We've got the tallest one here. This is fewer wraps, and this is fewest wraps. So now what you do in this particular method is you direct the heat right at the center. When you do that, you can see by the glow that you get a little bit of the disc to the right and the left of center, also getting some heat. I'm going to heat this center disc until I don't feel that it will get any flatter on the surface. So I'm just watching it fall down on the surface. And when I feel that it's pretty much as low, I think it's pretty much there, as low as it's going to be, I will heat a little to the right. Now I am heating the center a little bit, but also the first disc to the right. And then when that one lays down, I'm going to heat the third disc. So now I've got the center, the interior one, and the last one on the bead. And when that one starts to fall down, notice I'm watching, I'm trying to angle the heat away from the hole of my bead because this is where that hole wants to kind of contract and become spiky. Now I'm going to angle. This is important. Look at the angle on the marver. I'm doing an angled roll, and this is going to turn out to be about half of my bicone. Now I still have heat in here. I have a little bit more work to do at the end, and on the end of the bead, I mean. And so here's my chance to angle it a little steeper. Always, though, when you roll, you have to be sure you have enough heat for more than one complete roll. It's fine if you have many rolls, but you don't want to have fewer than one. If you find that you're rolling like that and you end up with a ridge across the bead, it means that you hadn't preheated all the way around the outside of the bead. You only had heat on one side. So now I'm going back to heat that center disc, or where it used to be, and one disc to the left of it. It's the same thing. And when that disc to the left of it starts to fall down on the surface, and it gets pretty much as far down as I think it can go, you know, it's becoming blurry, it's blending in with the base bead, I will move to the last disc, and I try to keep the heat away from my hole as long as possible. And then when that last disc has also laid down on the surface, I'm going to try for some rolls. Remember what I said about how many times around. I think I like this side a little better than the other side, but it'll all be good in the end. See, there was still a divot there. That's because I had a divot to begin with. Okay, a little more heat. Do some nice rolls. This is because, Neil, you found me my good marver. Mm-hmm. Now, when you do this, the peak always moves. See how the peak of the bead is a little to my right? It has moved a little off center. That's because we're not done yet, okay? I'm gonna finish this side, make it nice, make sure my rolls are more than once around, always. And now I'll go back to the first side to finish the first side, and this is what pushes the peak back to the center. Normally it doesn't take very long to get your heat back into the base bead, but you know, I'm talking and I'm doing it very deliberately for you guys, so it is taking me a moment. But there's my purple getting hot, And when I think it is pretty hot, I'm going to come back, and this will move my center back to my peak, back to the center. So there you go. That's nice. And now, believe it or not, I'm going to heat that center and just soften it a little bit by rolling directly on it, because I don't want it to be like an angle, a sharp angle. I want it to be a gentle curve. That's just a design issue for me. Okay, bead looks pretty good. Ends look pretty good. It's a demo, so you'll forgive me. All right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the white twisty that we made a little while ago. Yeah, I think this is the one we made. I'm not positive. We made one of them. I'm going to clean off the end so that it's a little bit of a pointy tip. I'll heat it and I'll pull it off on my mandrel just to pull to a point. That didn't really work very well. There we go. Okay. Now it's a little more of a point. And Neil, if I hit you, I apologize. Okay, I'm pre-warming it so that as I apply it, it doesn't take much heat to get it to stick down. I've made my flame a little less aggressive. I want to get heat in the base bead because I want to be sure that my stringer is going to stick as I go. And then I'm going to stick it on with heat. Now, I'm not worrying about how pretty or not pretty that first stuck part is because I'm going to come back and clean it up. But what I am doing is I have a little bit of pressure in my right hand. I'm pushing down this twisty and I'm coming up under the flame, which is hard to see from where you are, but you're going to have to trust me. And as soon as I get on there, I'm going to heat it again because it went on hot, but the bead may have been hotter and I want to get my temperatures closer together. The second thing I'm going to do, usually you want to start and stop kind of opposite each other. I came pretty close. Second thing I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce heat where I'm not working, just to take care of the part I'm ignoring. Make sure my twisty is heated on. I hate when they pop off. It does happen. And this one is going to go, same thing, heat the tip, tack it on. It's going to go pretty much next to that one, but not pressed against it. I want to see like a little river of purple in between because I need that for the tapestry effect that I'm going to do in a moment. Okay, so this second one is now on there. And what I want to do to make sure that it's going to stay, first of all, I want to make my ends cute, you know, just get them hot and tuck them down. And then I'm going to look at the other end. I love my tungsten tweezers. They can get hot. They do not stick to the glass as readily. They can stick to the glass. And so now I'm just making sure that second one has a pretty lot of heat. What you have to worry about here is undercuts, where the snake of the twisty is on the surface but doesn't have enough contact with the surface to stay attached. So I am trying to heat it down so that in profile, instead of looking like a snake or a tube on the surface, it looks like half round molding. It's half flat on the bottom and has a domed top. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the piece of aventurine. Now again, this is a pretty thin part too. I'm going to get the tip a little tapered. I'm going to start on the bead opposite where the two white ones are. That's the only standard I have. In other words, maybe I got all the way around with my white and maybe I didn't, but I'm going to start opposite where they are. So I have to kind of look for that spot, preheat the tip of the aventurine. And again, this is a pretty thin piece of aventurine stringer. So to work it, I'm just bouncing up into the underside of my flame. Oh, that was an air bubble in my aventurine stringer. So I'm just going to tack it on where it popped off. And I will show you how to fix that when the time comes. air bubbles happen, and you know, into every life. All right, so because this is a mega minor, it has a lot of radiant heat. So as I apply that aventurine, I'm able to be somewhat under the flame because there's a lot of heat. So it does depend on the torch you're using, and knowing your torch, you could make a cool fluffy flame. Yep, see, there's an air bubble. That's when you have an air bubble, it will travel through the whole aventurine stringer. Oh, there it is. I knew I had a backup. And it can really give you grief. I just want to, oh, I think this is which is the one that was, I don't know. We'll use this, and if it doesn't work, you'll forgive me. But, you know, probably means that someplace in there I incorporated an air bubble, and then once you do that, you pull it the length of the stringer. And it's pretty hard to avoid. The way you avoid it is don't incorporate an air bubble. See? But I'm not really worried about these breakages because I'm going to be able to disguise them. Stay tuned. Ooh, man. Boy, if I can disguise all these, I'm really good. And we know, not so much. All right, so you'll see though why I think that they'll be disguised in a minute. I do think they will be. Okay, so this aventurine is on here for better or worse. And yeah, it has, you know, a couple problems here and there. Like maybe I would give this bead to my sister and not sell it. I don't know. And what I'm doing now, I'm using my knife to manipulate the aventurine. Okay. So I'm going to start with the aventurine stringer because I'm less worried about the white twisty. And you pick a spot where you want to put in a little pinch, and I have chosen spots where I'm worried about the crack showing. So it's just, what I'm doing is I'm taking these two stringer that travel next to each other. Can you see that on the camera, Neil?
Mm-hmm.
Great. And I'm just giving a pinch to bring the two of them together. And I really do think that in the end, the cracks won't matter, to tell you the truth. That's how I feel. Okay, so now, before I, you know, clean it up and make sure the ends are pretty and everything, I want to do the other two. So you've got these two twisties. I'm going to preheat them. Then I warm the spot where I want to do the pinch. I come out of the flame. Helps that the tungsten tweezers are nice and pointy. If you're using metal tweezers to do this, quench them every time you pinch. And then shake them dry or tap them off on your pants or something so you don't drop water onto the bead. But I am liking this. I haven't made a bead in this style very often for a long time, and I just really feel like, I don't know, I feel like it's like an old school bead that you don't see too much. And actually, that's a class that I'm working on, which is techniques you don't see anymore that used to sort of sweep the world and be so hot and exciting. And that's probably the next class that I'm working on. I want to say that I will be teaching at the Corning Museum of Glass studio this spring. In June, actually, maybe that's summer. I'm going to teach a class in borosilicate chain making. That is a week-long class that'll knock your socks off. It's so much fun. And you do make a lot of chain, and you learn a ton. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, Neil, can you see if I don't know if I can move. Can I move over to the light for a second?
You can see it right there.
Okay, right here?
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm doing is I'm looking, just using my eyes. Here's my chance to make sure that where it was cracked, I've kind of disguised it by pinching it. And of course, you could do a whole lot more on this bead. You could dot it, you could do more strands, Maybe you could even do a strand that's half aventurine and half twisty. I think it has a lot of nice potential and would be a very lovely pendant. So I hope that made sense. And even if you're not here for this live meeting, if you want to ask me questions about this, you can always email me or find me on Instagram, and I'll put all of that in the heading for the video so that you'll be able to have that information. Thank you.